Hello, I'd like to welcome you to an introduction to the first week of this class. We're just going to take a short stroll down the political economy lane and talk about some concepts that are overarching that will inform other things that you learn within this course. First, let's just get down to basically how economists are viewing the world. I'm sure some of you know this already, but it's good to bring everyone up to speed. So let's talk about the market. Okay, what is the market? Really, I'm talking about the economy. And so you have players in the economy. You have producers and you have consumers. Now, the producers produce goods and services that the consumers want. Okay, and the dynamics of supply and demand result. Now, those goods and services have a price signal. They basically have a price, and that determines, you know, it's sending an economic signal to the consumer of what to buy and what not to buy based on their preferences. And as a result, the consumers pay the money that go back to the producers. So you have this market system that is working not just in each nation, but there is actually a global market system that crosses political boundaries. So we have the market, okay, but the market or the economy is actually embedded within the political and regulatory system. And so when decisions are made or the market fails and is not doing what is desired by the populace or by the leadership of the populace, they basically can intervene into the market with policy and regulations in order to move the market in the direction of, of desired policy, or try to solve what's called a market failure so that the market reflects true cost and benefits. However, the market's embedded within the sort of the legal and political framework, but the legal and political framework is obviously embedded within the environment. Okay, and it's because of that the market being also embedded within the environment, okay, doesn't just create its own goods and services. It basically is part of the environment, and thus you have sort of natural goods or what we call resources that feed into production. And these natural goods or resources are just one aspect of production. There's capital, there's labor, there's other things, but we'll just focus on this. And from an economics point of view, the field of economics that focuses on this is resource economics. Also, because of the activity of the economy, you have outputs that are not goods and services. These are basically, one could say, wasted resources, because for every input of natural good and resources, the business actually wants to maximize the goods and services they can sell. However, these external goods, or often called pollutants or emissions, okay, go back out into the environment. And they actually, the higher the rate of these pollutants or emissions, it just reflects the inefficiency of the economy for taking natural goods and resources and not using them to their utmost value. But when we talk about free goods, private goods and public goods, these are the type of goods that sort of flow into the economy, flows into the regulated and political environment, and actually the cultural environment too. They come into three classes. We have this what are called free good, that is good with no opportunity cost. So things like water, the hydrologic cycle, air or the atmosphere, open space, open land that is not privately owned. Okay, all these are free goods. Then you have private goods. These are the goods that basically are the goods and services within the market. And what makes a private good is the aspect of what's called rivalry and excludability. A good is rivalrous. If one person consuming it uses it up, means someone else cannot consume it. So if you buy a bottle of Coca-Cola, unless you share it, you drink that amount of Coca-Cola. Once it's gone, no one else can use it. So the consumption is one way. The good is excludable also if you can prevent somebody from using it. For example, take a Broadway play. Not everyone can see it. You basically have to buy a ticket to go in and see it. And so without that ticket, you're excluded from that product or that service. The last category is a public good. It acts like a free good in the sense that there's no rivalry and it's not excludable. So this example is streetlights. If you walk down and use the lighting of the streetlights, it doesn't limit the use of anybody else to use the lighting of the streetlights. And that's an aspect of a free good. That basically, if you use some water, it doesn't exclude other people from using water, or if you breathe air, it doesn't exclude other people from breathing air. But what makes a public good different from a free good is that it's not free. Even though anybody can use the lighting benefit that society gives, it still has to be paid for, and it's not paid for directly, but it's paid through the taxes. So everyone pays for the lighting, and everyone gets to use the lighting. So that makes it a public good. Now, if we go back to this, and we really drill down, what we have in the environment is what we call the commons. The commons is basically those free goods that anybody can access, okay? And ideally, from an economic point of view, there's a theory called Pareto optimization, where basically the utilization of the good by any one person doesn't limit the utilization of that good by anybody else now or into the future. And so economies always ideally try to move towards Pareto optimality. Okay? But with the commons, there are challenges because of the way that the market and the regulations interact with these free goods. So the two systems that impact the commons is the policy legal system, okay? And it has many aspects to it, and there is also the market system. And there's a list of aspects about the market system here. And so both these systems impact the commons. The question is, can both of these systems create the commons in a Pareto optimal situation? That is, basically leave its ability to provide goods and free goods and services, not just for those who use it now, but for those who will use it in the future. Now, the legal aspects, the regulatory aspects, often rest upon, especially within country boundaries, on what we call the public trust doctrine. And this is used to intervene to help protect the commons. Distilled to its essence, the public trust doctrine is a concept that is both simple and intuitive. The doctrine requires government to maintain the public trust through stewardship of natural resources upon which our society, and by extension our economy and the government, depends for continued existence. Ecologists would call this ecological or environmental services that the commons provide. The public trust doctrine has been called the oldest expression of environmental law, and its roots extend at least as far back to as 6th century Roman law in Western culture. Now understand that Roman law influenced the creation of English common law, which in turn influenced the creation of the American legal system. And the public trust doctrine survives in the United States as one of the most important and far-reaching doctrines of American property law. In looking across the globe's nations, one can also see the public trust doctrine is manifested in many of countries' legal systems. And besides Europe and the Western tradition, the doctrine is inherent within the culture of the ancient societies found across Asia, Africa, the Muslim countries, and even Native Americans. Now, what is interesting is the most recent permutation of this doctrine is an expanded view of the common law concept, where it is being advanced as legal grounds for compelling regulations of greenhouse gas emissions. So there is a move by scholars, legal scholars, to use the public trust doctrine as a way to leverage the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions across the globe. But there's no overarching set of regulatory doctrines such as a global public trust doctrine. However, since the 1972 United Nations Stockholm Conference, it was recognized that there is an urgent need for international cooperation in environmental control. And this was forcefully expressed in that conference's adopted what we call the Declaration on the Human Environment. But the UN since then has not formally declared a universal public trust doctrine, nor has it the structure to use it as a point of law to address such global dynamics as loading greenhouse gas pollutants into the environment. Thus, then we have to ask if there's not a legal way to deal with a global greenhouse gas loading onto the commons. Is there a market system? Well, when it comes to the commons, even within national borders, the market often fails to address the health of the commons. This failure is often due to the acknowledgement of factors external to the market for which the costs are not internalized in the price of a market good or service. These externalities can actually be both positive and negative, but the market has not brought them into the price of production. Thus, that price has not been passed on to the consumer to make choices of what they prefer. So in order to internalize externalities, it's often required that policy and associated regulations are passed to do so. And so the market, as we said, was embedded into the political and regulatory system, and the regulatory and policies that are made need to intervene to deal with such a market failure as these externalities. Now, probably one of the most famous examples of a negative externality was used by the evolutionary ecologist Garrett Hardin in his 1968 treatise called The Tragedy of the Commons. In fact, this is a very lucid and clear example of how a negative externality impacts the environment and what we call the commons and free goods that come from the commons. So he used cows as an example. Now, cows are purchased and are sent to graze on the commons until it's time to sell them for slaughter. In his example, the price of the cow brings depends on her weight at the time of the sale. And the weight of the cow depends on the amount of grass she has eaten. The amount of grass she has eaten depends on the number of other cows that are grazing on that same commons. So hypothetically, when Farmer Smith adds a cow to the commons, that cow adds a second cow to the commons. That cow, by eating some of the grass, imposes a cost on all the other farmers because their cows won't gain as much weight because more of the grass was consumed by Farmer Smith's two cows. Now, for Farmer Smith, this cost loss, this loss of all the other farmers as far as value of their cows, is external to his decision. The only cost he was concerned about was buying the second cow. And because he does not have to pay the loss that his neighbors have incurred, there is no market signal, there's no incentive for Farmer Smith to not continually buy two cows. Now you can take this example further and say, well, Farmer Jones has just saw what Farmer Smith did and said, well, that makes economic sense. I'm going to put two cows on the commons. And thus, Farmer Smith, Farmer Jones are getting an advantage, but Farmer George basically is being impacted by the decision of his two neighbors. They now have 4 cows on the commons and he has 1. And his 1 is getting less and less valuable. There is a cost by the decisions of the other individuals. If you take this logic to its extreme, everyone starts putting as many cows on the commons because those are individual decisions for individual gains. However, there's a point in which there's so many cows on the commons that it exceeds the carrying capacity of the commons. That is, there's not enough grass so that each cow gains enough weight to offset the purchase of an extra cow. And it goes further than that. You can have actually what's called a bifurcation or an environmental shift, where basically the cows have eaten so much grass, trampled so much land, that the ability for renewal is curtailed, and all you need is one external environmental factor to change, such as a drought, and possibly all the cows may die, and the system collapses. So this tragedy of the commons is played out over and over again. It's with the world's fisheries, freshwater resources, energy consumption of forest. And in order to avoid the tragedy, one needs to somehow avoid signals that allow individuals to make individual decisions, because it does make economic sense for the individual, but doesn't take into account the cumulative effect of all these individual decisions. So, can we solve the market failure of the tragedy of the commons? Well, Nobel laureate Elinor Ostrom wrote Governing the Commons, and her work was a watershed piece that came up with a way in which the commons can be addressed. And she basically developed 8 principles of how groups should interact in order to preserve the commons. A lot of these principles has to do with equity, fairness, evaluation, and the ability to not only evaluate but to adjust. And so at a certain scale, this may have worked well or can work well, because in order for this to occur, there needs to be both a way in which to quickly get information in order to provide feedback and decision making. It also requires that there needs to be a strong group identity that has a sense of power to be able to make change. But most importantly, it needs a communication system so that the different parties can rapidly communicate with each other about the cumulative effect based on individual decisions and change how those individual decisions are made. However, if you look at these 8 points, and we want to apply this to greenhouse gases, okay, there's certain things that are put here. It's sort of like monitoring agreed upon behaviors. Well, who's going to do the monitoring of behavior? Fair distribution of cost and benefits. Oh, what mechanism is going to allow such a distribution of cost and benefits at a global scale when we're talking about greenhouse gas and climate change? Fast and fair conflict of resolution. Who's going to be responsible for mediating such a conflict? And most importantly, authority of self-government. At the global scale, there is no global government. Okay, you have multiple governments. Now, there has been a positive step to this. The Paris Accord had all but 2 nations in the world sign on to the accord initially. And so, you're creating at least an indication that you want to move towards a group effort that will avoid the tragedy of the commons. However, unless you address the who, the how, and the what in order to implement these 8 steps at a global level, we have to look at concurrent and mutually supporting other alternatives. So when we talk about the climate commons, we're really talking about emitting greenhouse gases into a system that has a certain carrying capacity before there's a bifurcation. And that bifurcation then comes back to impact the people that created the greenhouse gases, and that's what we've seen. That greenhouse gases have been loading from anthropogenic sources in large quantities since the end of the 19th century. And the impacts of the systems, the carrying capacity of that system, and indications that that system is ecologically shifting is metrics such as increased temperature, increased extreme precipitation, increased extreme drought. Those type of things are all metrics that are measurable, and that the economic side of the house and the business side of the house are starting to track very carefully. But the issue with the commons here is there are no economic systems to incorporate the negative effects of the externalities that are produced by greenhouse gases. And thus, if the externalities are not internalized, the cost of production does not reflect those impacts. And because the cost of reductions are not associated with a changing climate, there's no incentive for the producers to change their behavior. And likewise, if those costs are not being internalized, then the price of the goods and services going to consumers do not incorporate these external negative externalities. Now, if the negative cost externalities were internalized, either through the market, through regulations, through a combination of market and regulations, they would be basically reflected in the price of the product or service. And thus the economic signal to the consumer would be such that they would choose logically and rationally less costly goods and services that have less of these greenhouse gas costs internalized. And so the good behavior would be rewarded with purchases versus the bad behavior would be avoided because of the high cost. So the tragedy of the climate commons is dealing with individual market economic incentives for individual rational behavior that do not lead to rational outcomes for the group. So we need to change how to change individual behavior so that the group outcomes are not as dire. Now, one approach that has been tried within countries and actually has been quite successful is a market approach, since it's emissions trading. In the US, emissions trading became part of the law in 1990 with the amendment of the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments. And if you look at this graph, since 1990, the blue is the emissions of sulfur oxides, or SOx we call them. The reds are the emissions of nitrous oxides, NOxes. A high percentage of SOxes and NOxes come from energy producing plants. And you can see from mid-1990s up through towards our time, SOxes and NOxes have been dropping since the implementations of emissions trading. Concurrently, over that same time period, the number of units out there that are built for energy generation have increased. And so it seems that this approach, emissions trading, is one way in order to deal with individual behavior to create a group outcome that is beneficial. Now, emissions trading is really what we call a cap and trade approach or strategy. Cap and trade is actually dealing with a market failure by creating a regulated market. The components of this is that there's a baseline created in which everyone has an allowance for polluting. And this is post best available control technology at that point. So anything post fact, okay, they're given an allowance for pollution. And that is monitored. Okay, it's easy to monitor at the end of the stacks. Now, industry A here decides, they understand the concept that anything that comes out of the facility that's not a good or service, such as an emission or pollutant, shows inefficiency in operations. They want all their inputs to become goods and services that they can sell and not have a whole bunch leave as non-valuable emissions. And so they decide, proactively to change standard operating procedures, change control technologies, and possibly change their inputs to reduce their emissions. And so their emissions drops down below their allowance amount. And so there's a component here that's called unused allowance. Now, another industry isn't being proactive. In fact, they're exceeding their allowances, and they don't want to be fined for exceeding their allowances, okay, through air regulations. So what they do is they buy this unused allowance from those that were proactive to basically offset this extra pollution here. And they pay money back to the proactive industry. So the proactive industry is a leader, but it's not a lost leader. They basically, for their good work, they're rewarded for being proactive by selling these unused allowances and basically gaining capital that they can reinvest into their company. And many of the companies continue to lower their emissions by using the money that comes back to them so that they actually get more money over time. Now, there's two components about this. One would say, well, you're encouraging some people to pollute because they buy the unused allowances and they can exceed their allowance. And that is true. So you have a regional difference across the country of some people that are reducing pollution, improving air quality, improving the quality of the communities in which they live. And then there's other people that are allowing to exceed their emissions, and they're reducing the quality of life of the community in which they are in. But from a national standard, if you step back and say, what is the sum total of this approach of cap and trade? And you get back to this is what the sum total is, that the total SOXs and the total NOXs are being reduced across the country, even though there is a disequity in the system of who gets polluted and who doesn't get polluted. Now, this equity issue has to be addressed, and it has to be addressed through standards. But the other thing about a cap and trade system is that this amount of allowance that each company is given at a baseline point, once it is shown that companies can lower that amount through best available control technology, best standard operating procedures, substitution of inputs, okay? Then once there's enough companies that show that they can be down at this level, the standard drops down to that level. And now everyone, that is the amount of allowance. And so this becomes an iterative process. So over time, we will capture and start to eat away at the disequity of the good behavior and the not so good behavior. So you have to look at it through a long range vision. Now, will this work for carbon, especially on the global scale? Well, it's exactly the same model. The Kyoto Protocol was really a carbon cap and trade system, okay, passed in 1997. And so the emissions they were looking at was not SOx and NOx, but they were looking specifically at carbon, greenhouse gases, and they call it carbon equivalent. And so they basically, with Kyoto, would set up a carbon market, okay? And so that market was based on how many people are staying below the allocated greenhouse gas emissions, and they sold these into the market, and those emissions were sitting in a marketplace, and then those people that needed to come down to that amount, okay, through a mutual agreement that was signed at Kyoto, they would basically purchase that to offset their exceedance. Now, what this allows is actually countries in an international scale, if countries don't have the wherewithal at the moment, either the expertise or the fiscal resources or the national resources and systems to drop like possibly a developed country does, it allows them to purchase, okay, these savings in order for them to continue to develop and move to a situation that they can do what OECD or developed nations are doing. Okay, so in some ways this is an equitable situation over time. Now, Al Gore was our representative at Kyoto. He negotiated, was our negotiator. And When he came back, President Clinton signed the accord. However, the Kyoto Accord was never ratified by the Senate. And without that ratification, all the legal precedences and all the legal foundations in which a treaty has to be met were not in place. And so after the Senate refused to ratify the Kyoto Accord, it was sort of in this netherworld until finally Bush, who followed Clinton, basically said that they were not going to participate in Kyoto, and basically stating that the cost to the U.S. economy would not be reflected from the benefit of reducing greenhouse gases under the Kyoto Accord. Now, people may say, well, this is just some early obstructionist to an inevitable reality of greenhouse gas loading and climate change. But to be honest with you, there were some challenges with Kyoto. SOx and NOx in acid rain control in the United States was under one regulatory system. It was an equal playing field. Kyoto didn't have any overarching regulatory system. And as such, it was dependent upon the evaluation and monitoring by the financial institutions that were going to be the repository of credits, carbon credits, and would be the market of selling those carbon credits internationally. And that kind of assurance was not enough for either the US Senate nor for the Bush administration to support the accord. And so from our perspective, it is not really an active part of how we approach international treaties. However, Kyoto has been working in order to foster more sustainable development and less greenhouse gas loading in developing nations. And the Kyoto Accord was renewed by the UN recently because of that. The Paris Accord was basically a follow-on to getting a consensus in order to develop policies in which to do more international monitoring and as a result sending signals to signatories to basically do more to reduce greenhouse gases. Now the other sort of market mechanism is really a intervention by the legal or regulatory system into the market, in which basically a tax is imposed. Basically, they're internalizing the cost of carbon by putting a tax on the production of products, that is, goods and services. That tax increases the price of goods and services for the amount of carbon loading or greenhouse gas loading that is reflected by the production of that specific good or service. That price is translated to the consumer, and the consumer will see that there is a higher price than possibly prices for similar or substitutable goods that basically produce less greenhouse gases, and thus the consumer choice or preference will drive, ideally, producers to change their behavior to sell more goods. So the tax is one way to do it. The government intervenes to change the market to move in line with policies. But a priori, you need to have a national policy to say that this is important. Now, the opposite of taxes is subsidies. You could use subsidies to subsidize good behavior versus taxing bad behavior. But both of them are an intervention into the market. by the regulatory environment. Now, the one thing about carbon taxes is that, unless there's some way that they are uh, what we call scaled or avoid creating a regressive situation, there are certain parts of the economy, segments of the economy, uh, that segment is translated into people that can afford an additional cost because they are at the low to middle or low end of the economic stratum. And so you will disproportionately, or you can disproportionately uh, penalize those people who are least available to provide support of a behavior to change greenhouse gas loading. So anytime you impose a tax or a subsidy, you also need to think of equity and come up with a way to provide relief to those that are most impacted and least able uh, to respond to such a policy decision. So that's about all I'm going to start with for this week, and we will be able to uh, discuss some of these aspects later in the course. But always feel free to contact me um, if you want to pursue a topic further. And I obviously will be reading your work and responding to it. So hopefully this will be a joint effort in learning and moving forward. So enjoy the week.